Hello and welcome to the Flix Forum podcast, where each episode we go back and we look at a Netflix original film in the order of release. This episode we have Netflix 243rd film from 2020. It's the war drama film Da 5 Bloods. It's directed by Spike Lee, starring Delroy Lindo, Jonathan Majors, Clarke Peters, Norm Lewis, Isiah Whitlock Jr., Melanie Thierry, Paul Walter Hauser, Jasper Paakkonen, Reno and Chadwick Boseman. I'm Jesse. I'm here solo for this film from 2020. I'm excited to talk about this one. So if you are keen on this film and haven't seen it, give us a pause and come back a little bit later on, because I'm going to spoil this and talk in a little bit of detail about this one, because this is a Netflix original film that there's a bit of info about, which I'm very excited for. The last few weeks, and especially when we look at a few of the international films, there's not an awful lot to talk about. But this one, I've got a bit, and we do start the show with the fast flick. So this is a quick little summary of what the film's about to give you that gist. This one is about a bunch of old Vietnam vets that are traveling back to find the remains of a fallen friend and possibly some gold. Ooh, intriguing. Good. Well, let's talk about this one. I want to talk about how this one came to Netflix. So, realistically, this is a film where we see 5 bloods throughout a film in present-day scenes. And these characters, we've got Paul, Melvin, Otis, Eddie, and David. And these are the individual names of 5 members of the African-American vocal group, The Temptations. Their fallen blood, who was the leader and inspiration for others during their days in Vietnam. His name was Norman, and there's some connections here because songwriter Norman Whitfield produced literally all of the Temptations music during their time at Motown Records during the 60s and 70s. So character names, very important in relation to some of the music that we hear in this film as well. This was Chadwick Boseman's final film to be released in his lifetime. He had one other Netflix film released later in 2020, which we'll get to soon, called Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. And Chadwick worked on both these films while he was undergoing treatment for the colon cancer that ended his life. So a little bit of a sad story, but such a recognisable face in this film as well. This film was originally titled The Last Tour, written by Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, and it was going to tell the story of 4 aging white veterans who were heading back to Vietnam. Oliver Stone, who we know has done some Vietnam-type films, he was attached to direct at one point, but moved on. And then producer Lloyd Levin, he read an interview that Spike Lee's favourite film is The Treasure of the Sierra Madre from 1948, and thought that Lee would appreciate the similar elements in this film, The Last Tour, as it was at the time. So Lee liked the premise, and he and his co-writer Kevin Wilmot, they rewrote the script to make it about black soldiers, and what an effective job they've done with this. According to an interview with Giancarlo Esposito, he was in talks to be cast alongside Samuel L. Jackson, Denzel Washington, and his son John David Washington. And if you've seen the film, you can probably work out the 2 characters they might play, but due to scheduling conflicts, it fell apart. Then we get to Feb of 2019, when it was announced that Netflix would distribute the film, and it was set to be Netflix's first film to screen at the Cannes Film Festival in 3 years. Because there was controversy after Netflix had screened its films at the 2017 festival over their policies of streaming versus the theatrical release. We've spoken about this on the show before. Very strict sort of rules in France, and some big disagreements between Netflix and the Cannes Film Festival. So Netflix subsequently withdrew its films from the festival for those 3 years. So The 5 Bloods was set to be part of an out-of-competition category at the May 2020 festival, but unfortunately, as we're seeing with a lot of the films at this stage, COVID-19 pandemic sort of forced the cancellation of the festival, which is a bit sad. Interesting about this film, the film uses 4 different aspect ratios as framing devices in this film, and it sort of distinguishes between the film's different time periods and locations. So we got the 1960s flashback scenes. They were shot in 1:33:1 format on 16mm film, and it sort of mimics newsreel footage from the time. And the cinematographer, Newton Thomas Siegel, proposed the idea and said that Vietnam was the first war that was really televised, and it was predominantly shot with 16mm film, and that's how the American population and public perceived the war. So the Netflix executives, they were a little bit resistant to this proposal given the challenges it presented in actually making it, but Lee was so adamant and eventually allowed to proceed. So really, really cool story, and there's this exception, I guess, of this brief scene filmed using a Super 8 camera at some stage, and the modern scenes were shot digitally. The present day scenes were framed in widescreen ratio, and it sort of evoked the aesthetics of films like Lawrence of Arabia, and then the present day jungle scenes were shot again at a different ratio to envelop the group with the vastness of the jungle. So also effective throughout. Really, really enjoyed that. A little bit of criticism, I guess, from some people from Vietnam that sort of stated that, even though we've got this new central perspective of this film of black soldiers and this justified message, it still sort of reanimates the tropes of victimizing the Vietnamese people and being an America-centric film too. So a little bit of criticism on that side. Apart from that, what are some translations for this one around the world? In Portuguese, this one translates to the blood detachment. In France, or in French, it's the five blood brothers. In Hungarian, it's the five comrades. In Polish, it's the five brothers. In Russia, it's five of the same blood. And in Vietnamese, it's called the five war friends. So all nice titles that still include that idea of the five of these guys being brothers for life or working together for life, even though they're not necessarily all together the whole time, but just that relationship they built by being in Vietnam together. This was released on Netflix on the 12th of June 2020 worldwide. Apparently it had a budget between $35 and $45 million, which is one of Spike Lee's biggest budgets, so quite a bit of cash. It was filmed on location in Vietnam as well as in Thailand from March to June of 2019. And this, before we get into the critic reception, I guess, awards-wise, this actually won 41 awards and was nominated for another 198 awards. Big numbers. It did have an Academy Award nomination in 2021 for the Best Original Score, and also it was nominated for a BAFTA for the Best Supporting Actor for Clarke Peters. So let's talk about what critics and audiences are actually saying. We'll start with Rotten Tomatoes. Rotten Tomatoes, this does sit on a 92%. That's on 313 reviews, and that is certified fresh, so very, very high. But if we look at the audience on Rotten Tomatoes, 53%. So much lower, and that's on 2,500 ratings. So audiences didn't connect as much as the critics on this one, I guess. If we look at IMDb, a little bit higher, it sits at a 6.5 out of 10 on 53,000 ratings. And Letterboxd, sort of similar, score at a 3.5 out of 5 on 118,857 ratings. Huge numbers, and it's actually been logged by 157,000 people. One of the bigger Netflix films on Letterboxd that we've sort of looked at. So what are my early thoughts on this one? Context is, I watched this when it came out, and I thought I'd look back at my notes that I wrote when I watched that film back in 2020, and I wrote, it's a raw and impactful film. It arrived at the right time, not only for its story, but the prowess on display behind the camera. I still agree. What a film. This is a great film. Highly recommend it. Let's break into it. So we start with the characters, and I'm going to start with Paul. Paul, this is really his story more than anyone else's, and he represents so much about African Americans and veterans and the Vietnam situation. Almost everything that's wrong with war. And we see, he's a Trump supporter. He's got this Make America Great Again cap that he wears, and he's deeply damaged though. He's suffering from PTSD and carrying this guilt of one of the Five Bloods, Norman, who died when they were in Vietnam, and they had to leave him behind, and he's isolated in his own life. He's isolated and angry over the death of his wife in childbirth, so there's a bit of anger towards his son, who he doesn't really have a connection with, and he still holds this rage inside him, and this sort of keeps him angry at the Vietnamese people as they go back to Vietnam, that we see throughout as well. And that David, his son that I sort of mentioned, he seems estranged, and we can see that he's trying to do good in his life. He's a school teacher, and he wants to make things right with his dad, but he's so concerned that he sort of sneaks up on his dad and comes to Vietnam to see him, and because he's worried where he is, he needs support, and he's sort of said, maybe this is the last chance I've got to be with dad and build that connection. And I'm trying not to spoil it too much, and it's this, that their relationship is a very key part in this narrative. The other Five Bloods that we had, so Norman was Chadwick Boseman's character, who we sort of when we do see him in these flashbacks, he's got this godlike presence on screen, and he's someone who tells the black story to his friends, to his comrades, to his bloods, and they all look up to him, and he's just got such a power on the screen that we see. And the others we see, we've got Eddie, who likes to take photos, a bit of a businessman. Melvin, the other guy, I guess the other sort of key character is Otis, because he's sort of the guy that's sort of running this trip and organising them all, getting back together, and the deals to get them in and out of places, and to try and smuggle this gold out if they do get it out. And he's got the other big side story with Tien, who is someone he had a love affair with when he was in Vietnam during the war times, and he's had a child with her and sort of hasn't had anything to do with either of them since that time. And it's sort of the struggles we see that she faced when they left, and being left with a child who wasn't the same colour skin as her, and the issues that she faced in Vietnam herself too. And Otis, I guess, sort of is that second best character, or not best character, but the second big character, because he was such a good friend to Paul, such a good friend that, you know, he's named as his son's godfather. So Otis and Paul obviously had a big relationship together. The other sort of side characters we see throughout, we've got Hetty, who's this French heiress, I guess, who sort of turned her back on her French family's fortune and the money they've made off Vietnam to try and do the right thing now, and she's over there with a group of two other guys sort of removing landmines. So they sort of play a bit of a role throughout the film, as well as Vinh Tran, who's this tour guide who helps these Five Bloods together to sort of get around to where they need to get to find the location of Norman's body to get him back to America, as well as giving us, the audience, a little bit of an insight into the Vietnamese side of things as well. The last one's sort of our villain, who doesn't really play much of a role, but Desroches, who's this dodgy French dude, and, you know, he's just there to, I guess, as a nice reminder of the French's ever-presence in Vietnam as well, right throughout the ages. The director, Spike Lee. Briefly, we'll touch on Spike Lee because I don't really need to say much about him. 133 directing credits. Films such as Malcolm X, the TV series She's Gotta Have It, Black Klansman recently. One of my favourites of his was Inside Man from about 20 years ago. But I think my all-time favourite Spike Lee, maybe this one could be it, the Five Bloods, but Do the Right Thing. What a film that is. If you haven't seen Do the Right Thing, highly recommend it. Jump out and see it. But we'll talk about some scenes. What are some scenes that stood out in this one for me? And I found it really hard because it's a lot of the techniques throughout this film that are used that are just so effective that they're enjoyable. So throughout the film, there's archival images and clips and speeches which are sort of intertwined into the film perfectly as to where the characters are at certain stages, to sort of make that comparison between the 60s and 70s and today. Perfect. I love the Apocalypse Now references throughout. There was so many. It was so good. I think I mentioned this earlier before, but those different aspect ratios and the film stock and the camera use just added so much to this film, to transition between where we're at to tell the audience what's going on. The specific scenes, I guess, that there's a teamwork scene where David stands on a landmine and Paul sort of steps up and he goes, let's think back to when we were here in our younger days. We'd get a rope, we'll make him fly, and that was really nice to see. Another scene with Paul is he sort of goes off by himself. He's almost completely lost the plot, and he just talks to the camera so powerfully. And then there's such a good follow-up with him being reunited with Norman in like this dreamlike sequence before his actual demise at the hands of gangsters. It was just so effective. And finally, the last sort of shootout or showdown, where the remaining survivors sort of trick the French and their leader Desroches that the gold's in this bag. They're just going to hand it over, and it's full of rocks. It was good. That was good. Not much that I didn't like. I'm being really picky. The helicopter crash from back in the Vietnam War days. I thought the CGI in that was probably a little bit ordinary, and the digging for gold. I found it a very very repetitive technique. I get why they were doing it, because they were trying to create this tension about, we know that there's landmines around. I was anxious at stages the whole time for the bomb going off. Even though I'd seen this film, I knew that the bomb was going to go off at some stage. I just think it dragged on a little bit. That's about it. I'm ready to talk about some themes, some ideas in this one. And I think that, this film is anti-war. Like the soundtrack, it's centered around Marvin Gaye's album from 1971. It's an anti-war album, What's Going On. The idea that war's about money and money is about war. Just that whole idea of what do we actually gather from war. And obviously race plays a huge part in this. You've got the idea they very blatant with the statistics about black soldiers being drafted to fight in Vietnam at massively disproportionate rates, and the idea too of them being pushed to the front line, and that ties in closely with the idea that the Bloods don't die. These guys together, I think there was a quote, it was like, we multiply, and it alludes to the fact that this treasure or this gold that they're going to find, it given to their families and their descendants who are each fighting their own battles, not necessarily in Vietnam, but of oppression and the idea at home of how they're still so far behind, and also this idea of this bond that these Bloods have together as well, from serving together. It's such a nice idea, and that ties into very blatantly towards the end, or explicitly, with the the Black Lives Matter message as well. And I sort of spoke last week with the film that we did last week. I think it was like The Last American Crime. The film is so impactful, I can't remember the title, but I spoke about the poor timing of that release based on what was happening in America at the time that this film came out. This one, perfect timing. It's about a country that considers blacks as lesser citizens. So I think that, this film couldn't have come out at a better time. There's also that idea too of being trapped in the wartime memories of grief, and the relationship between memory and fantasy and violence, and the struggles of veterans and post-traumatic stress, and we've seen the addiction to prescription drugs too. This almost like brokenness, and that through that brokenness, does that distort people's ideas of what greed and honor and loyalty and revenge are. It all sort of ties in, and I think this film does all of that so well. I do like this film. There's not much more I can say, and I'm going to sort of make a bit of a reflection on what did I take away from it. I can't really think of anything other than this is a Netflix original film. When Netflix give the money to the right people with the right vision, they can deliver great films, and this is an example of that. So I think it's good. I'm ready to wrap it up. We give the films a rating out of 5. From memory, I gave this film a 4.5 when I originally watched it. So I don't know, am I going to stick with that? I think, this is a great film. I loved it, as I mentioned before, originally when I watched it, and that's nearly 3 years ago. And to be honest, I think I like it a little bit more. I can barely fault anything in this film. It's an exceptional piece of impactful filmmaking that really could resonate with anyone, especially considering the themes and the ideas of Vietnam intertwined with current American society that's still relevant. I'm giving this a 5 out of 5. This is pretty much a perfect film for me. I love this film. I hope others do as well. 5 out of 5. Great film. We're on socials. We've got Twitter, we've got Facebook, and we have Instagram. Give us a follow, give us a like if you can. Question I had is, how would you describe Paul? What are his character traits? Like, is he a hero, or is he a victim, or is he an aggressor? As we see, most of the footage we see of him is him being impacted by the war. So how could you best describe him? And maybe it's different for different stages of his life, but realistically, when we see him, yes, he's very aggressive and upfront and almost not in control of what he's saying and doing. So maybe he's a victim. What are your thoughts on Paul? Let me know, because we're ready to move on to next week. Next week, we have another 2020 film. This one's switching up completely. This one's from Japan. It's an anime romantic fantasy film called A Whisker Away. It's directed by Junichi Sato and stars Mirai Shida, Natsuki Hanae, and Hiroaki Ogi. Bring it on. I'm excited. Japanese anime. That's what we've got next week. As always, thanks for sticking around, having a listen. Hope you enjoyed this chat. I hope you enjoyed this film. Let us know on socials. I'll see you next week.